So to start, these concepts right now of complexity, distinguishing between the simple, the complicated, and the complex. So some people might already be aware of some of these concepts, but in case others aren't, I'll go through them. But I think they're really important to understand, how we approach programming and how we approach evaluation and learning in these times. I don't think anyone here is going to argue that, COVID has changed the context in which you work. It's not the same now as it was before. And you're trying to find ways for things to be effective now and also in the future, but it's not so clear on what that is going to be like, what you need to do to be effective going forward. So, we're in this stage of uncertainty, and this sort of situational assessment diagram on the page here, bottom axis, you can see is certainty. When there's very close to certainty or far from it. And on the other axis, we have agreement. That's social agreement on the outcomes that are to be pursued. And, that again, it can be everyone can be in agreement, or there's a lot of disagreement. So when things are everyone's in agreement, and there's a lot of certainty that what you're going to do, the actions you're going to take are going to lead to the outcomes that you are trying to create, you're into that simple context. That, classic, some examples of simple contexts would be like, hey, do we all want some cake? Say we are all like, yes, cake would be great. Well, how do we do it? Well, here's a recipe on how to make a good cake. All we have to do is follow these steps. We are certain we're going to get a good cake if we follow those steps to the T. So very simple. Another one's often food banks under regular circumstances. If the theory is someone's temporarily lost their job and they can't afford food temporarily, we want to alleviate their hunger, so we're going to give them food. Giving them food is most certainly going to alleviate hunger, and there's not a lot of disagreement on whether or not you should do that. So again, very simple situation, but those are becoming more and more rare these days. And then we get complicated situations, which are, you can have technically complicated or socially complicated. So technically complicated, classic is sending a rocket to the moon. Very complicated, takes a lot of expertise. There's a lot of variables, a lot of formulas that you needed to follow, but it can be done, it can be figured out. And socially complicated might be something like medically assisted dying. There's some people that completely disagree whether that should be a thing, that should be an outcome to be pursued, or and then there's other people that want it. So we know how to do it. It's just, should we do it is where there's a lot of disagreement. And then lastly, from this diagram, we get the zone of complexity, where there's not a lot of certainty that this is what you should do, and doing it is going to lead to the right outcomes. So we're particularly in the stage right now where we need to limit the spread of disease, but we also need to protect people's mental health. We also need to think about the economy and people's jobs and keeping roofs over people's heads. How do we do all of that? How do we balance that right now? Now that we're not at the peak of the curve anymore, we're somewhere in between, maybe a second wave. So we have to keep all these things in mind, and it's not clear what we should prioritize. We can think about the situation right now with kids going back to school in September, and there's a lot of people that are definitely not comfortable with that, and other people are like, well, I need to go to work. I can't afford to not have my kid go to school. So there's a lot of these, like, what should we be doing in that case? And we don't know what the outcome's going to be of sending them back to school. So COVID's kind of put us in this situation of complexity. Another framework, very useful, it's quite similar, is the Cynefin framework from Dave Stonin. He has obvious, he's called the one context. That would be pretty much like simple from the last the diagram on the last slide, he adds chaotic as well. So they're still complex and complicated, but he adds chaotic. Now, chaotic is, there's no patterns. There's nothing you can look to for like how to be effective in this situation, because often it's novel. It's a novel situation. It's a crisis, and you're dealing with a lot of things that are brand new and unknown. So it's not clear what cause and effect is going to be in this situation. So when you get into these situations, and a lot of that was at the very beginning of the pandemic, things were happening, and this is brand new to people. How do we deal with this? What's going to happen? What are the things that we need to do? A lot of that is in that situation, you need to just act and sense where maybe some stability, and try to get to some stability in the situation. So to take it away, take yourself and your stakeholders, the people you're working with, out of the chaotic and into the complex situation, where you can, some patterns of normal life, some patterns of how to be effective and how to support start to emerge when you get to the complex situation. So again, we've gotten over here in Canada that curve, and we're on that tail end. So organizations did a great job, I think, dealing through that chaotic period, and we're moved back into the complex. So the complex doesn't just have a lack of agreement on what to do, and it's unclear if what you do is going to lead to the right outcomes, because sometimes lots unpredictable with things. We can think about COVID, how we needed to socially distance or physically distance, but what did that do to people's mental health? A lot of the work had to go online, and then how's that affecting the economy? A lot of these things weren't predicted ahead of time. Also, how did the physically distancing and not as many people at work, how did that play with some of the Black Lives or Indigenous Lives Matters movements? There's a lot of talk about how that was, and that was completely not predicted, before COVID happened. So these things can be unpredictable, and it's because in a complex system is an adaptive system. It's learning. The actors in it are learning. That's changing how they act, and how they act changes the system. And then they need to relearn the new patterns. So that there is patterns to be observed and informed your knowledge and your action, but then those are always changing, they're always developing. And we can see again, this situation, we're in phase 1, now we're in phase 2, now is there going to be a second wave? These things right now, the environment is constantly changing, and we're learning how to deal with it as we go. And that, ideally, we help change the system. We help flatten the curve, or, do other things like mental health and so on. So that is, maybe I'll back up. That's the quick assessment on how we're now in this complex environment, and some of the ramifications of, what it is to be in a complex environment. And so that will have implications, and I'll get into that next on, how you design and plan for programming and how you evaluate programming. But I'm going to pause now, see if there's any questions around this concept of being in a complex environment. Right. Does this fit with people's experience with the work they're doing during these last handful of months? Seeing some head bobs, so that's good. Okay, and we'll move on then. Okay, so before we get into how to do it, how to design programming, and got something in the chat here. 1 second. Yeah, it's definitely some agreement about moving from the chaos to the complex fits their experience. Thank you, Kristen. So yeah, in the simple or complicated situation, this was where the traditional approach to creating and planning and designing programs and evaluating them, these are the situations where that fits and works and it's appropriate, where the goal is to develop a program model. So a program model is sort of a set of rules or processes and steps on what it is to do this program. And the goal is to be like, if you do these things, you follow these rules, you follow these steps, you are going to be effective. This works. This model works. If you don't follow that program model, if a funder's given you a grant to do that model, and you don't do what you said you're going to do, if you deviate from the plan, evaluation would say, well, you have implementation failure. That was a bad thing. We can't assess what you did, your program's impact, because you didn't implement the program. So that would be a traditional approach. And traditional, we have process evaluation or summative evaluation. We want to either try to refine those rules, refine those processes and steps, or we want to judge just exactly how effective is this model, are these set of rules to achieve a certain outcome. And often that's with trying to find some kind of quasi-experimental methods to attribute the precise amount of change that this model is responsible for creating. So that's often like, classical program, like what we're doing when we're designing programs and what we're doing when we're trying to evaluate them. Okay. There we go. Now we're in the complex situation and programs need to adapt. If you're not adapting to these changes that are going on with COVID, you're not being effective and you're most likely going to be doing something harmful. When COVID happened, we need to physically distance. So a lot of programs were doing things face to face. If they're like, no, we have a model, it's face to face. We have to continue to do this model because that's what we said we were going to do, and that's what we're going to be judged against. You're going to create harm. People are going to get sick. So you can't, obviously you can't follow the plan. You need to adapt to be effective. So in this context, you can see, the traditional approach has those steps, plan, evaluate, or plan, act, evaluate. Developmental is much more doing all those things together, side by side, kind of back and forth. You're planning your program to the best of your abilities, but then you're also paying attention. You're implementing it and you're seeing what happens, what's working, what's not working, what do we got to do to change it, what's changing in the system. You're evaluating not just your program, but what's going on out there in the environment, what's changing, is there gaps now that you need to address that weren't there before. So with developmental, it's both the system of what you need to pay attention to isn't just that program now, it's a wider program and how it's interacting with a wider system. And all that's happening more, they talk about it in real time. So developmental is a utilization focused approach, making sure that when decisions need to be made, and that's going to be way more often than that end of the year now, when that normal reporting cycle, it's about doing that real time or on time as decisions need to be made. And the goal is more, when you're in the complex situation, the goal is more is gathering the evidence to show you were responsive to changes, you were effectively responsive to changes, and you can tell a convincing story of how you contributed to positive change or contributed to the change not being as bad as it could have been. So it's more about contribution rather than attribution in this when you're in these settings. So when you're not trying to prove how much impact you have, rather tell the convincing story that these things happen, so we adapted this way. So it's really important to track what's developing, what you're doing, and why. So there is emerging patterns in complexity, and how do you deal with those? Again, we talked about programs being rules. But this is where the principles focused come in. You can also use effectiveness principles. So rules are really good in simple or complicated situations, but when everything changes, they tend to no longer be relevant. So we already talked about the face-to-face situation. It's like, well, that's no longer relevant today. We can't do it. Food is always a good analogy to help these concepts sink in. So the recipe, again, the rule is add a teaspoon of salt. But principles they provide guidance, but they're context-dependent guidance. They still are trying to aim for something to help you be effective in some way to achieve something, but they stay relevant no matter as things change and as things develop. So principle for cooking would be season to taste. So who are your guests? How salty do they like their food? What is the situation? Is it a date night? That's going to change rather than it's just an average Tuesday night. Like, what are you going to do and how are you going to season? Again, so instead of, well, our program, the model is this is a face-to-face program. Well, a principle could be to be effective, your programming has to occur in a safe space. So that is going to be different. What that safe space is going to be different in pre-COVID. That might be face-to-face is the most safe space we can create for our participants. But after COVID, it might be, Zoom. It might be, a public distance porch consultation because something about their background in their house or something might not feel as safe to them. So it really is context dependent, both the individuals and what's in the environment. But it could be different each time or as things develop, but you're still following that same principle of making sure it's a safe space. So I'm just going to give an example of some of the work that I've done here recently. And this is a program in Hamilton that was seeking to help youth retain their jobs. So they had worked with employment agencies, got a job. Now the challenge was how do we ensure they are able to retain those jobs? So the staff, through talking to youth and service providers, they learned that there was many different reasons that youth lose their jobs for not having the right basic needs or mental health to sometimes skills and performance-based issues. So there's many different reasons, and these kids were having many different variety of challenges, have variety of strengths, different situations that they're in, kinds of jobs. So there's all this multitude of difference that they're going to have to address. So they realized they couldn't just do the same thing with every youth and have it be relevant for every youth or as effective for our youth. So they figured out and they followed a certain set of principles. There's a few core pieces of the programming as well, but you can see there, these are the principles on the screen that they followed to help guide them on to know how to deal with the different youth in the different situations with the different challenges. So one, it was like, well, we'll have it be client-led and we'll start with where they're at. Some of them were in crisis. So they have to deal with crisis issues rather than long-term program, long-term career planning issues, where other youth started, and that's what they needed help with. So for each youth, they were doing something completely different, but again, they were able to consistently follow these principles to help them be effective with each youth. And so if we're using effectiveness principles, we can evaluate how effective those principles are for achieving the outcomes we want to achieve. So again, rather than a program model or a set of rules being the thing we are evaluating, now with principle-focused evaluation, we are evaluating the principles themselves. So we're not evaluating the specific thing you're doing with principles-focused evaluation. So It's not the, I don't know, Code for Canada. It's not the coding workshop. It's the principles that are guiding how you're doing that coding workshop, and doing those principles make that coding workshop more effective. So the main questions we're asking is it meaningful to the people that are supposed to follow this principle? Then if it's meaningful, like, are they adhering to it? And then lastly, if it is adhered to, does it help lead to the desired results? So I was thinking of another example of how to, help think these things through, what it might look like. So an example principle might be, this one would be like classic capitalist theory, where it was like, well, everyone pursuing their own best interests, it will lead to everybody being better off in the end. So the principle would be everyone should pursue their own best interests rather than others' interests. So we can evaluate that, and then we would, if I was the evaluator, I'd be like, is it being followed? Is it meaningful to who should follow it? Now, this one is everyone should follow it is the principle. So the answer would be no, not everyone finds this principle meaningful. There's people that have alternative economic theories. So some people, yes, very much so. Some people, no. Do those that are meant to follow it adhere? Again, it's meant to be followed by everybody. So some people are definitely adhering to it and other people are not. And then we could look at, what are the results of following this principle? We could look at groups, organizations, and microsystems, compare them to other systems, other nations, and we can look for, what are the differences, what are the outcomes by following this principle and not, and as an evaluator, without doing a very rigorous study, I would say, yeah, we could say, in certain instances, yeah, it's lead to a lot of technological innovation, things like healthcare. It can lead to great innovation with having that profit focus, and that can lead to better health overall in a population. But we also know that capitalist markets often achieved by exploitation or oppression, and so there's definitely has been groups, we talked about our First Nations, that have not benefited from these systems. So in some instances, we would say no. Following this practice, this theory was supposed to be everyone was better off, and we're not seeing everybody being better off. Most maybe, but not everybody. So we could do that evaluation of that principle. And just a very brief, quick note here is like, so principle-focused evaluation and developmental evaluation, they're highly related. They both are approaches that are very useful in complex situations. But it doesn't mean that you can't use principle-focused evaluation in a complicated situation. And it doesn't mean all developmental evaluation is principles focused, but that you can combine both, doing it in that sort of real-time setting and also taking a principles focused approach. So I do see a question here already in the chat. I'll read those through. So who is determining the principles? Do these principles iterate? So to answer the first one, who is determining the principles? Program. So this is where we're talking about program design. If you're designing the principles, what are those sorts of principles like we had in the previous slide, if I could get back there, that you think are going to help guide you in being effective in the work that you're doing. So it can definitely be the program designers, but I would also argue it's really important to incorporate and gather, or maybe even have them lead the design of the principles, the stakeholders, the clients, the participants that you're supposed to be serving. So I mean, a lot of the times people don't, and but and it can be an iterative process. So your other question is like, do these principles iterate? So the process, of designing out what the principle is, evaluating it, and then you can refine it. If you're like, well, this almost works, but we need to change the language a bit to make it a better, more guiding and useful principle, that is definitely possible and recommended. And by iterate, I'm not sure, but it does. There is situations where principles are step by step. Quinn Paddens, who authored the book on principle focused evaluation, he did have an example of truth and reconciliation. So first, it's speak the truth. If you can't reconcile if we're not speaking the truth. So first, it is speaking the truth, and again, what that is every time will be different situations. The truth's going to be different. How you speak it different, but and then how you reconcile. But these are principles to like repairing relationships. How to be effective at repairing relationships. But yeah, so that one was this has to happen first before you can do this next thing. Who is determining authenticity, spirit of principle rather than the letter? As an evaluator, yeah, if you're doing principles focused evaluation, you have that question about, is it meaningful? Is it authentic? So you would have, speaking to the people that are supposed to be following it, gathering their insights and trying to tease that out. And, is it meaningful? And, are they following it? Are they adhering to it? So it's, there's a lot of there can be flexibility there, right? When you talk about to the letter. So we don't want to get too into rules-based things, right? When you have a principle, it often is like, is it sort of more of the spirit rather than like, if you're following these principles, you have to follow this principle, you have to do these rules, the steps. It kind of defeats the purpose. So how do you maintain consistency between evaluators, and especially as evaluators change / turnover? That's always be a challenge, right? Like there's certain models where you have internal evaluators and you might have somebody on staff for longer. And, having, you can have someone help with as a coaching model to build capacity within your own organization so that there's some knowledge consistently. So, and I've done that before, and I've tried to build evaluation capacity within an organization where it's building it with just one person is very risky because that person leaves. So creating documents, but also having other people. So they might not have the evaluator title, but building some capacity with them and understanding with them as well, involving them in the process so that if one person leaves, all that knowledge and capacity doesn't go with them. And this is just, where some of the resources are for getting support with doing developmental evaluation, principles focused developmental evaluation. So Interweave right now, and they will again. So the first one, they have expressions of interest due. They fund many things, but one of them being developmental evaluation coaching that they provide up to $10,000 a year. That is to go to basically the coach that's going to be your coach. So you don't have to pay. It definitely can be that you don't have to pay anything. Sometimes there might be additional costs that you might want to support, but I've done where the organizations have just that $10,000 was enough for the coaching support. And yeah, so first one is due this Friday, but they do these 3 times a year as well. So that can help people start to apply this approach. And lastly, right now that I'm aware of, it just came out, is the Ontario Trillium Foundation's Resilient Communities Fund. So they do these. This is up for $150,000 for a year, and applications are due September. So that is, they have a budget line there of up to for evaluation. And as we're discussing, I think, given the context we're in, most likely for a lot of the work people are doing right now, developmental approach and principles focused approach, they're going to be relevant for that. So working that into those applications and taking that approach to those grants will be very useful. And I've heard before that the grants that put evaluation and good evaluation budgets into their grant applications were more likely to be accepted, be successful than the ones that didn't put any budget for evaluation. So it definitely should help. So there, as I said, there might be other funding resources out there, but those are a couple of the ones that are like near term that I'm aware of. Yeah, so again, I find a lot of value in this approach. That's very, that's a quick high level, overview of those two approaches and why they're relevant for this complex situation. I would love to support more projects doing principles focused and NDE. I've been doing that for a while, but yeah, the principles focused especially been getting more and more, finding the relevance and excited by it. So I'm happy to answer your questions now or support the people on the line outside of this. If you're interested in submitting for a grant or otherwise, you can let me know. But yeah, if anyone has any other questions at this point, I'm happy to discuss.
Yeah,
Yes,
I have a question there, Paul. I'm wondering if you can provide an example of principles focused evaluation in regards to an organizational level, as opposed to just a program or an individual client who is then being evaluated from principles focused perspective.
sure.
So rather, yeah, just a more high level kind of approach.
Sure. So one applicable, the work I've been doing, one organization, they have some principles around leadership in their organization, and actually with them, it's both how to do leadership internally and externally with their partners as well. And they're focused on like principles around more feminist theories of leadership. So feminism has principles, and so they have a lot of principles that guide their way to have leadership. So in some ways it's how to have it shared. It's not having power over people when you're trying to be a leader. It's so traditional leadership is I'm the leader, I'm going to influence how we do things, and you're going to follow. For them, it's okay. So shared leadership and feminist leadership is more about creating the opportunities throughout the whole organization for other people to find ways to lead where they have their specialties. So if you're a manager, it's very participatory on the decisions we're going to make. I'm going to involve other people in what those decisions are. I'm going to find ways that they can take some leadership in the decisions that I need to make as a manager, but I'm also going to try to build them up and give them the skills and the knowledge. And then one of the other principles were really related was there needs to be you need to work to build open relationships of open communication and trust and care within these. So, if you're a manager, you need to trust when you're sort of giving up. There's the micromanager that's like, I don't trust you at all to do anything right. So I have to manage everything. But no, you need that. If you have that relationship of open communication and we trust each other, then I can hand this off and you can lead. So it wasn't just a single principle that was important. That was ones where we talked about iterative, where it was step by step, but there's also principles that's like, these aren't standalone. They're a cohesive package in order to be effective. Like if you don't have a relationship of trust, you can't share leadership well.
Great, thank
So
you.
that was, again, that was internal, but that would also work. So if that organization was doing things with their partners, you know, again, it would work in a way where it's like, well, we're not just do what we say, partner, and this is how we're going to do things, or we're going to try to work with our partners in that same sort of relationship as well. And to be honest, that organization, the work we've done, you know, it should point to outcomes. Like by sharing leadership, how does that make us effective? And you know, there's definitely data. You know, I don't want to get too, but like they have put out some papers out there in public. And one of the things they found, like sharing leadership again, so they talked about like how does this capacity stay? So they talked about like, well, the sustainability of leadership is better. So they have co-EDs. They have not one ED, they have two. So if one ED needs to step down, they have someone that's really familiar with that work that needs to be done. And so that work transition, the sustainability of the knowledge, the capacity for the organization, it stays there. And there's a lot of, you know, they've been right now that those two EDs have still been there. They haven't left, but you could see a situation where one person would step down and it would be like, actually, that was effective. We didn't like that transition wasn't as tough with the two EDs than it would have been with the one ED. So following that principle would help us effectively deal with that sort of transition. Okay, so I gotta I saw some stuff in the chat. I gotta bring it back up. So in this case, would you be evaluating at two levels, how effective you create trust/shared leadership, and then how effective that principle is for organizational effectiveness? Effective you create. Yeah, so there is like, there can be, you know, how effective people are. So if it's like you need to create relationships of trust or shared leadership, so you'd be evaluating, you know, is that meaningful to the organization? What are they doing to do that? You know, do the staff feel like that's in place, that they can trust their coworkers to take this leadership? And then then it would be, as you mentioned, organizational effectiveness. Like, are we being more effective by letting staff helping staff find more ways that they can take up leadership, and looking for examples of when staff have done it and what was the impact on the organization, what was the impact on the organization's impact. Maybe examples where, you know, in certain cases it's not happening, and comparing and contrasting you know, the effectiveness of those situations. So for sure, that exactly is what's going on. So I hear in these questions issues of layering and redundancy. Complex systems are layered and have multiple things going on that support the same objective. So I think that's a comment, not a question. But if it's a question, just to clarify, and I'll be happy to address it.
It's sort of halfway in between. So it is a comment, but it's a kind of follow up a bit to what was just asked.
I'm sorry, I have another street cleaner driving by at the moment. Give me 1 second and I'll be able to hear what you're saying again. Okay, that should be fine.
It's kind of both. It's a comment, but it's also a bit of a follow up to the last question that was asked. You know, in what way does your what you're proposing address that need for, or like that layering and that kind of multi like that positive side of redundancy. So like, how are you addressing a system that has a lot of layers and has multiple intersecting processes that are important to have that multiple intersecting processes?
Yeah, you know, it's, you know, when you're in a complex situation, there's a certain amount of like noise reduction that you want to do, but if you're not paying attention to that things are complex, then that can also make you less effective. So interdependent systems, different levels of systems interacting, yeah, you need to be paying attention to those things. You know, is there unintended consequences? You know, is maybe the redundancy useful in a way, or is it make you less effective? With the shared leadership, you know, there's a certain amount of, well, these are the principles. There can get these gray areas of like, okay, well, if we're sharing leadership and we got to bring people in and participatory decision making, you know, what decisions do we need to bring people in? Every decision, you know, if it's like, you know, it's, you know, what title should this report be, right? Like, do we need to have a all staff discussion every time I need to like write a sentence down on or choose a title for a report? You know, that could easily make you less effective. But you know, there's definitely other decisions where you should. So you know, working through those and making sure you're balancing, you know, those different aspects of your organization and your effectiveness, both like, are we being efficient in doing this, and are we doing effectively? Where does following these principles, and where maybe do we need another principle to guide, you know, what is when, in what context? So you know, there's different contexts we talked about and different changing. So maybe we need a principle on when you involve people in decision making, not just you should, because then it's like, well, when should we? Always? So hopefully that provides some clarification.